So as a musician, it was always my goal to be able to have my own recording studio. So over the last 4 months, I transformed my basement in my home to my own recording studio slash home office. I wanted to have a room that was soundproofed, that sounded great, that was isolated from my house, and a place that I could use any time of night without anybody else hearing me. So I was curious if that was even possible in a basement. So I want to take you through the whole process that I went through. What does it cost to make it happen? Is it even possible to actually create a soundproof room inside of a home that has kids running around? And what's the end result? So that's what this video is all about. So let me take you on a little tour. So to give you a little bit of context, I was a full-time musician for almost 15 years from when I graduated high school all the way up until now. And I toured all over the country performing and recording and doing lots of stuff. So audio has always been something that's been super important to me. I no longer perform on a regular basis and music is not my main thing anymore, but I still really love audio and I still really love the idea of being able to record and being able to help others record. And so the stage that I'm at now in my life, this studio was more of kind of something I always wanted to do, and it was making that happen versus actually trying to build a studio that was designed for like to be the next, Capitol Records studio. This was something that would work perfect for the type of stuff that I would create in here, but it also serves as like a dual purpose home studio that just happens to sound really nice. Specifically in this video, what I want to talk about is more of the construction side of things and what this whole thing is made out of and how have I soundproofed the room and how have I made it sound as good as possible. In another video, I will talk about all the gear that I actually use here, but that's less important to me. And I think for this video, rather than trying to explain what it takes to actually construct a studio like this in a house and still try your best to make it as soundproofed as possible. So this is what the basement looked like before we started any construction, and it was my goal to basically finish off about half the basement to make the studio. We have a pretty large basement, so half of the basement still is a lot of space. So what I did is just try to think about how much space I would need for the type of stuff that I was going to be recording in here, while still giving me a little flexibility to do a little bit larger things if I actually needed it. The one thing you'll notice in this shot is that there was actually a square framed out in the dead middle of the room. I don't really know what that was actually ever for. I believe it might have been for a bathroom a while back, but there was a square framed out right away that I knew would be perfect to actually turn that into the ISO booth for the actual recording that I do in this studio. And so I built the rest of the studio kind of around that idea that that would be used and built and really well done for just recording ISO stuff in there, and the rest of the room would be treated and sound great for the everyday work. So one of the most important things when it comes to a home studio is soundproofing, and it's something that is a lot trickier than I thought and something that's actually almost impossible to get fully soundproofed. Specifically in my basement, I have above me the living room of our house, and it is all hardwood floors, and there was no insulation beforehand in the ceiling. So it's wide open, it's very loud, so I knew I had to do a lot on the ceiling to even have a chance of getting rid of some of that sound. The rest of the walls in the room obviously had concrete on them. So concrete, no sound travels through concrete because nothing vibrates, which is where all your sound comes from. So I didn't really have to worry a ton about actually soundproofing the sides. It was more of the roof that was the trickiest part. I did a lot of research when it came to trying to figure out what was the best way to actually soundproof a ceiling to be able to get the maximum soundproofing for that. And spoiler alert, it's not 100% soundproof, and it literally is impossible to actually do that in the type of situation I had. But here's what I did, and it works pretty well 95% of the time. So in this whole studio, there are two types of insulations that I used. One of them is just your standard R30 insulation, which is a 10-inch thick insulation. Primarily, it's designed for ceilings. And then around all of the walls, which I'll talk about in a second, is all safe and sound acoustic treatment proofing that is actually specifically for like the actual way that it sounds in here and the soundproofing, but more of the treatment side of it, which I'll explain. So the way we did the ceiling is we took R30 insulation, and it was pre-cut for ceiling, so you can see that we put tons of insulation all the way around the entire basement on the ceiling itself. That was just to basically get the initial insulation in those wood beams because it didn't have any in there previously. So that was step number one. So we did a 10-inch insulation R30 followed by little spacers to help create that gap, which is great for soundproofing, followed by a 5/8 drywall on the entire ceiling. So after we did 5/8 drywall on the entire room, you then have to put another whole layer of drywall just to be able to get even more of the sound from the room upstairs traveling down here. The tricky part of putting drywall to drywall when you're doing soundproofing is that you can't simply just put nails between it, because the nails bring back the vibration, which brings back the sound, which then defeats the purpose. So what you have to do is have something that keeps them together but is designed for that actual purpose of soundproofing. After doing a lot of research, we decided to go with the green glue noise compounding solution, which is crazy because it's very, very expensive, but you also are told to use one whole bottle per sheet of drywall in between the next sheet that actually happens. So we had to buy, I think, 40 some bottles to be able to put one whole bottle per sheet. And then that gets glued from the next whole layer of 5/8 drywall onto the additional 5/8 drywall that is on there. So we now have a 10-inch insulation, a small gap, a sheet of 5/8 drywall, a whole bottle of green glue compound between it, and your additional layer of 5/8 drywall. So there's now 2 layers of 5/8 drywall plus goo between, plus a 10-inch insulation. Now, normally you'd think to yourself like, wow, you can't really do too much more in a room. And you'd be right, because really you can't keep going or else the room eventually is going to be the size of your head. We already had to deal with the fact that the ceiling in here is not super tall, so we couldn't just keep going and going and going to get perfect noise proofing, because then you'd be hitting your head on the walls. The problem was, would that be enough to actually completely isolate the whole upstairs from the downstairs? The answer is it gets close, but not perfectly. All the sounds that happen upstairs now are gone from the everyday sounds. So you don't hear TVs, you don't hear people talking, you don't hear the everyday person just walking across it, you don't hear like the little things that happen upstairs. But what you can't get rid of, and I don't even know how many more layers we'd have to do to actually get rid of it, is if the kids are running upstairs back and forth on a hardwood floor, you are going to hear that. You hear it obviously very muffled in comparison to what it was, but you hear big enough banging that you would 100% hear it if you were doing any recording. So it's not perfect, but you don't hear anything else that actually happens up there. So in the rare times that I'm recording and there is tons of sound happening upstairs from them running around, that's just the living room. We have another whole upstairs, which is actually the kids' bedroom. So I can just have them go up there if I was recording something, and you don't hear anything that's happening in there with just everyday sounds. The sound doesn't transfer the other way, so it doesn't matter how loud I am in here or what I'm doing in here. It doesn't transfer back upstairs, which is really nice because I can record at any time of night. I could also let people record here and not have to worry about them hearing anything that we're doing or that they're doing as well. So most of it is solved. So I will say that that did work pretty decently. Now, the tricky part is the fact that all that drywall and all that glue green compound stuff and the insulation and all the stuff that goes into that is not super cheap, because you have to buy a lot of drywall, you have to buy a lot of that green glue, you have to buy the insulation, and then you have to actually have someone do it if you're not doing it yourself. And in case you're unaware, 5/8 drywall is very heavy per sheet, so it was quite the hassle to make it happen. Luckily, I didn't do that. That's not my specialty at all. I had a contractor help me put all that stuff up, or really he put it all up. I helped him, but it was not fun at all. But all of that is just the ceiling. Let's talk about the walls. So there's obviously a big difference between soundproofing and sound treatment. Soundproofing obviously is trying to make no noise come into the room. Sound treatment is making the room that you're in sound really good, which is very important when it comes to an actual studio, because in a studio, you need it to sound good when you're recording. It's not just about if it's soundproof, and I think a lot of people get confused about that. I will say this whole idea was not mine in terms of how to do the wall this way, but my good friend Andrew Masters, who did a whole tour of his home studio, and I loved it. And so shout out to him. He gave me a lot of inside information of how to make it happen. But here's what we did that's a little bit unique that worked great. A huge pain, but it worked great. Normally, you frame up an entire room with your 2x4s and every 16 inches and all the way around the room. And then you drywall an entire room, you paint it, then you decorate it, and then you have to start treating it. But if you drywall an entire room like this in a basement, you have to do a lot of work to actually retreat it and then make it sound good, which I didn't really want to do that because not only is it expensive just to get tons of sound treatment, but you're kind of you're having to change the whole design of the room because you have to put panels in spots and it doesn't necessarily look how you want, so it becomes a big hassle. So what we did instead is we did your typical framing of the entire room like you would do in any builds, but instead of putting drywall on it, we basically left the beams wide open and we filled all of the wall with safe and sound soundproofing insulation so that right away it sounded great even before anything else was done. But the key is it almost was done because we were not covering up the walls and having to redo it by putting drywall. We went with this fabric design that you see. So what we ended up doing is going straight from the wide open frames with just the insulation to a really thick fabric, and we tightened it and stapled it all the way across the entire room. We cut it out to make it fit the size that we wanted. We chose what color we wanted, whatever, and we did it in the entire room. So the walls themselves look like regular walls that are a certain color, but they're actually just fabric. And because it's just fabric and fabric itself doesn't bounce sound around, you just have fabric right over top of insulation. So in turn, the entire room is perfectly treated without having to do anything else to the walls other than that. I will say it was a huge, huge pain to actually do, and I definitely wouldn't want to do it again. We chose to do really long sheets, and then this little strip that you see along the entire wall is just where the seam is. So they were, I think, 4-foot sheets of fabric, and then they were 100 feet or 200 feet long. We would measure out how long we wanted to go from one to the next, staple all the way across, and then right where it ended in the dead middle, we would staple really tight so there was no wrinkles. We'd then take the next whole layer and do the same thing in the bottom, and then right in the dead middle where we had the seam, we would put these little wood strip. So we measured where we wanted that wood strip, and we put it from top to bottom, stapled it all really tight, then put the wood strip, and then it kind of looks seamless even though it's a bunch of sheets of fabric together. I can't stress enough how annoying this actually was, but it really was worth the work. So what that allowed us to do is have the whole room already sound exactly how we wanted to, and the only thing we really had to put any sound treatment on was the ceilings. Now, I didn't even do the rest of the ceilings right now. It actually sounds pretty much what I'd want in this room. There are a couple of spots that might be a little bit more reflective to sound than some, but the primary spots where I do most of my work in here and recording are all treated to how I want. And then the room where the most recording happens in the ISO booth, that is entirely treated on all the walls, on the ceiling, on the floor, so that sounds exactly how I want to sound. So this is inside the actual ISO booth. This is about a 7-foot by 7-foot square, and it is plenty of room that you can have a guitar in here. You could sing in here. This is kind of where I would do all my actual recording for me personally, whether it's singing or whether it's voiceover work, whatever random stuff happens. We did an audiobook in here. As you can hear, it's very, very quiet and clean in here. The great thing about this specific square, the reason I chose this to be the ISO booth, is this is actually not underneath the living room as well. So all the issues we have of when the kids run around doesn't actually happen in here because the main living room where they move is over there. This is actually underneath the staircase and to the left of the staircase, which is not normally where they're running around. So this room gives me very, very good isolation, very good soundproofing, and I can do a lot of recording here without having to worry about anything at all. Also inside this room, we actually did double safe and sound insulation. So on the whole normal part of the studio, we did one layer and then the fabric. On the inside here, we actually did 2 layers of this safe and sound insulation, plus an actual outside layer of drywall because we didn't need the other side of this to be treated with the fabric. So the back side of this is actually just in the unfinished basement, but it has a lot of isolation, as you can tell. I decided to just go this route with the blankets rather than actually doing the entire fabric perfectly again, because it's more tricky in here because of how small it is, and it just wasn't that important. So I just hung a bunch of nails and just hung all the blankets, which gives me the exact sound I want anyway. And then I already had a bunch of these blankets already, so it just made it easier. Then I just treated the ceiling with just some more 4-inch insulation just to be able to make it sound like it does in here. And I'll tell you, it works awesome. And then right on this side right here, that's where the actual door to leave the ISO booth is. So I didn't want to worry about having to treat, obviously, the door and treat any other wood that was there from the frame of the door. Just basically put this right over top of the door. So you basically just go like that, open the door, and leave. The whole room, every aspect of the square is just treated exactly the same, and it just sounds great. And it may feel a little small on camera, but it's actually a very nice size room. Like with the guitar and all that, with singing, you'd have no issue at all with feeling like you're cramped. And we have one light source in here, which is what you see, just basically on a dimmer. And then I have a little LED strip that I can just kind of add mood to it. Most of the time when we'd be recording in here, it's much quieter and much kind of darker, just to kind of give that nice vibe. And works great. One thing I did is obviously I knew that I needed to get cables into here, like XLRs and headphone cables and all that. On the other side of this wall is where my desk is that I was actually sitting at. So I just basically cut out a hole that came right through the insulation and right through the fabric down below. It's not pretty, but it works perfect. It's behind the blankets, so I could feed any cables that I have through here. I also have an Ethernet cable that goes all the way from the actual main router in my house all the way through the ceiling, all the way through the insulation, and all the way to here, so that I have a hardwired internet connection and a whole new Wi-Fi router inside this office. So I was just kind of thinking about those things when I was building it. So this right here is the ISO booth door. This is the door that goes to the actual studio in general. Right outside there is drywall. So like I said, we didn't go crazy out here. It's not even finished the outside of the drywall because I don't really care what this side looks like. This is really just the only passageway that goes here. But because I'm not trying to make this like a recording studio that people record at all the time other than me, it doesn't need to look perfect. But you can see I just put basically this little corkboard thing that holds all the cables for easy organization. And these are solid core doors, so they're very thick doors, heavy doors, and they provide some more isolation from the room. But like I said, all the stuff in there is treated anyway, so it works really well. And then all we did for the floor is we just did this like fake little wood looking floor, and it's the kind that kind of snaps together. That was kind of an annoying process as well. Everything had to be pre-cut at the end of each side so that it could be the exact size, but we put one little weather stripping thing underneath it that you're supposed to do for these floors. And then my wife and I just laid the entire floor. And then to treat kind of the floor, because obviously that would have been pretty reflective, as you can hear even just over here alone, how much echoier it is on top of this floor directly. We just put these nice big carpets that just absorbs the sound. I wasn't going for complete like deadness in a room, because in a studio, I don't want it to be so just dead. I want there to be some sort of liveness to it. So it's very little, but you can hear obviously the difference even just right here, but this is not normally where we'd record. But the floor works great because if something happens to it, I could just, replace certain pieces. It would be a little bit of a hassle, but it's also good because it doesn't really scratch, and it's just a nice little floor. We have this in another part of our house, and it actually worked really well. And then my wife just did all the stripping and all the whatever this stuff's called. I don't know. I'm not handy. She did that whole stuff around the whole room and did a great job. So what can you expect in terms of cost for building a room like this? Obviously, there are a lot of factors that go into it. The biggest one being, are you going to do it yourself versus hiring someone to do it? And are you doing the walls the same way that I did them, or are you going to do a different method? A lot of variations. But when all said and done, I probably spent about $6,000 to $9,000 on the actual room. It would have obviously been way cheaper if you only do a single layer of drywall, if you don't do all the insulation, the type of insulation that I got on the walls. So you could absolutely build a room or finish a basement, for example, to be like a man cave for way cheaper than that. What ends up being expensive in this type of setup is all the actual insulation and the treatment to make it happen. So a lot goes into a project like this, but I love the final result. It's been really, really nice having this room. You'll notice that the room is very empty, and that's only because I kind of purposely made it so that the room's always wide open, so that if we are going to record something like drums or someone else comes to record some instruments, I don't have to move the whole office and studio around to make it happen. I wanted it to basically be wide open so that it's easy to do whatever we want in this room. If you want to put more couches and things to make it more of a man cave style, obviously that would be even more expense that goes into that, but it really depends what you're doing with the room. For me, I just kind of wanted the open space. I'm gonna do another whole video about what specific gear I use in the studio, but that would make this video way too long. So this was more about what it's like to construct a home studio and your cost for those things. When it gets into cost about the actual gear that you need to make the studio happen, if you're in an audio world, you know that that's another whole video with another whole budget. So we'll talk about that in the next video. Thanks as always for watching. Like this video, subscribe if that's something that you're into, and hope to see you all again very soon.